Welcome, everyone, to this forum and discussion on presidential accountability reform, sponsored by Harvard's Law and Government Program of Study. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do, but first I want to thank the Program of Study for sponsoring this event. I want to thank in particular the faculty co-sponsors, Vicki Jackson and Daphne Renan, for their help. And also to thank David Sanchez, class of 22, the program fellow who put this event together. So we have two extraordinary guests to talk about the question of presidential accountability and presidential accountability reform. I'm going to introduce them briefly, then I'm going to have a discussion with them, ask them some questions for about 30 minutes. Then I will try to take your questions and put them to our guests. If you want to ask a question, please do so in the question and answer function, and I will try to read those and convey some of those questions. So Bob Woodward needs no introduction, but I'll give him a brief one anyway. He's the associate editor of the Washington Post, where he's worked since 1971. He has shared in 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and he's authored or co-authored 20 books, starting with All the President's Men, all of which have been nonfiction bestsellers. Bob has written #1 best-selling books on the last 9 presidents, including 2 about President Trump. Bob Schieffer described Bob Woodward as maybe the best reporter of all time, and for what it's worth, I concur. Michael Horowitz is a graduate of this law school and the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, and he's been in that job, I think this is his 8th or 9th year. He's also the chair of the hugely important Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which Congress set up to watch over the $3.5 trillion pandemic spending, maybe more soon. Michael's had several jobs in the Department of Justice, including he served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. He also served in the criminal division of the Justice Department. He was a partner at Cadwalader, Wickersham, and Taft. Bob has conducted some extraordinarily sensitive and important and difficult investigations during his time at the Justice Department, all with integrity and to bipartisan acclaim. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. I'm so grateful. Bob, I want to start off with you. One of the things you try to do is, you tell me, it seems to me that one of the things you try to do is uncover the truth about what's going on in government. So I want to know if that's how you conceive of your job and whether that works, what it accomplishes, what it purports to accomplish.
Well, yes, what really happened, and having done this for 50 years, the goal is to make it nonpartisan, to make it very aggressive. I teach a journalism seminar, and one of the students yesterday raised the question, what does the truth accomplish? And you find lots of students saying, wait a minute, once we establish or come close to establishing the truth, what action follows that? And for sometimes political reasons, but I think there are just a lot of students, a lot of people in the country who were baffled during the Trump administration, not for political reasons, but this idea that we can eliminate the truth or have no truth. And I think that's alarming to people, and quite frankly, I share that alarm.
Let me just follow up on that before I go to Michael. So one part of it is that some people that the question of what is truth is now kind of on the table in the country. But part of the way that truth discovering and truth telling works is it makes the accountability mechanisms of our government function, gets Congress involved, gets the executive involved, gets other institutions involved. And there was a concern in the Trump administration that those functions aren't working anymore. There were a lot of things that came out about the Trump administration that were pretty bad. The president was impeached twice. It looks like he's not going to be convicted either time. Do you think that truth relates to the accountability functions of government the way it always has, or is there a problem there?
Yes, but I think in my end, the reporting end, the responsibility is to be very proactive in trying to find out what happened. If I can tell a quick anecdote, during the George W. Bush administration, I did 4 books on his wars in Afghanistan, and Iraq. And I found that I was getting lazy doing interviews at home, going to people in their offices. And when somebody declined to be interviewed, I thought, okay, that's the way it is. The First Amendment allows people to say no. Then there was one four-star general who was critical to the story. I found out where he lived in the Washington area and went to see him. The best time to go is 8:15 on a Tuesday because it's not Monday and it's not the latter part of the week. These are leisure hours, or nominally so, for a four-star general. So I knocked on his door and he wouldn't talk. I had sent emails, used intermediaries, nothing. And he opened the door and looked at me and he said, "Are you still doing this shit?" And I poker faced it, learning from CIA case officers. It's best to be silent if you can at times, not show any emotion, not say anything. And he then got a disappointed look on his face. I think not in me, but in himself, because he said, "Okay, come on in," and sat for 2 hours. I was then able to develop a relationship of trust and visit him many, many times. And I really was embarrassed that I didn't get there sooner. I think in my business, we're oddly enough, people say we're too aggressive. I think we're not aggressive enough, and we've got to show up more to get at least the best obtainable version of the truth by talking to everyone.
Thank you. So Michael, I want to ask you a version of the same question. I mean, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're in the same business as the Inspector General of the Justice Department of trying to uncover and let the world know about, to the extent you can, the truth. I want you to please start off by just telling the audience briefly what an Inspector General does, because not everyone might know what your job is or how important it is. But then talk about the truth finding function, how you conceive of it, and how you think truth finding relates to your job and to government accountability.
Great. So just briefly on what we do as IGs. So I oversee the Justice Department and all of its operations as an IG. That includes the Federal Bureau of Prisons, FBI, DEA, ATF, all of the parts of the department. We have about 500 employees, $105 million budget to oversee 100,000 plus employees at the Justice Department, and a $28 billion budget. Our mission is to improve the effectiveness of the department's operations and to provide recommendations in our oversight work when we do it. A big chunk of my staff, 200 people of the 500 roughly, are auditors. They do financial statement audits, but they also do performance audits. So our bread and butter is that day-to-day work, looking at the department's operations, making recommendations. We issue about 80 plus reports a year on those programs. We post them publicly unless classified or other Privacy Act issues prevent us from doing so, but that's not usually the case. And even when that is an issue, we try and get as much out publicly as we can, so folks can go to our website. It's all public. That's the key to our work. We also do several hundred misconduct investigations a year involving department personnel, criminal and non-criminal. And we issue public summaries of, obviously, if it's criminal, it becomes public through a charging document. If it's administrative, it's against a high-level official, we issue summaries of that work, and that also can be on our website, can be seen on our website. So we're all about three key principles. It's our independence, it's our efforts at ensuring there's transparency in government, and ensuring that people are held accountable for any misconduct, wrongdoing, or mismanagement of the program. So that's sort of at our core what our function and responsibility is. And what we're trying to do is, and I agree with you, similar to what journalists like Bob and others do, is to let the public know what their government is doing, who's doing it, whether it's being done consistent with law, rules, regulation, policies, whether there's mismanagement going on, and if there is wrongdoing going on, we are trying to get out the facts, because I agree with you, there has to be a foundational basis for a discussion, and that's about facts and truth. And with that, ensure that there's then accountability thereafter.
So you've been an Inspector General for 9 years. I mean, how can you make any generalizations about how the truth finding function operates with accountability and whether you've seen changes over time? And that's a broad question, but
yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think, it certainly has gotten more challenging, as for the reasons Bob indicated. There's this basic fundamental question sometimes of what is the truth? And the way we've gone about doing this, and I've done it for my 9 years there, is from the most high profile review, whether that was our FISA review from 13 months ago, or our Clinton email review from 2018, or our Fast and Furious review from 2012, is to dig and dig and dig, just like, Bob, I'm sure, has 50 years worth of stories explaining. Looking, in my case, I get to look at all of the emails, all of the documents, all of the records, and put it all together in a voluminous report, as we've done, because people have to know that there are these facts, that there are these truths. They have to see it. And I'm certainly proud of what we've accomplished on particularly those high profile reports where, 13 months later on our FISA review, there were, I'll simplify down a 600-page report. There's a lot more to this, but there were two major findings in that report. One, that the FBI complied with its policies in opening the Crossfire Hurricane investigation in July 2016. And two, that the FBI failed in numerous ways in its representations to the Justice Department and derivatively to the court, the FISA court, in seeking FISA applications for Carter Page. And those two findings, which have been scrutinized considerably, along with all of the subsidiary ones, have stood the test of time now for 13 months. And I could say the same about Fast and Furious and the same about the Clinton email review.
Okay, Bob, I want to go back to you and focus this a little bit more on presidential accountability, which is our topic. So you famously broke the Watergate scandal and covered the Nixon presidency and its foibles, to put it mildly.
Foibles? That's a nice word for crimes.
To put it mildly. Yes, crimes. And you also were there, in the post-Nixon reforms in the 1970s. There were a whole slew of them. And then you, of course, covered the Trump administration. You covered every presidency in between closely, but you also covered the Trump presidency extremely closely. You had, I think, 18 or so at least on the record interviews with the president. You wrote 2 books about it. So the first question is, how would you, there's been comparisons between the 2 presidencies and their presidents, two presidents' approach to legality, lawlessness, government accountability. How would you relate them, and how do you relate the kind of the predicament we're in now in thinking about presidential reform to where we were, say, in 1975?
Well, first of all, Nixon, because of his tape recordings, secret tape recordings, which came out, and eventually the Supreme Court ordered that they be turned over to the prosecutors, showed that Nixon was a criminal, and the Watergate burglary itself was clearly a crime. In the case of Trump, I think the Mueller investigation, though it showed some problems, needless to say, in the way Trump behaved, they never established conclusively a crime. And in the second book I did on Trump Rage, which came out several months ago, I interviewed Trump 9 hours and 42 minutes. And he is, the way he deals with the truth, he sometimes does, I think, truly does not know what the truth is. But the big finding there was that he knew the virus was coming to the United States. He was told in a top secret meeting, January 28th of last year, so just a year ago, that this was going to be the biggest national security threat to his presidency. Imagine being president and having the national security advisor come and tell you that. And then his deputy, who had worked in China, showed how the Chinese lie and cover up these sort of matters. And Trump did not act and failed miserably. In one of the interviews with him, I asked him the simple question, what is the job of the president? He said, the job of the president is to protect the people. I think that's a good definition of a key presidential responsibility. And he failed to do that in a way that I found stunning, but it took me 4 months to find out exactly about that top secret meeting. And as Michael knows, it's hard for a reporter to find out what goes on in top secret intelligence briefings. And it took me that time, and I could put it in the book and explain all of this well before the election. In the case of what Michael Horowitz and the IG does, he now, I mean, think about this. This will, I think, blow people's minds. You are involved, Michael Horowitz, in an investigation of the January 6th riot in Congress. And it's going to take you months, if not longer, to get to the bottom of that. And we'll, I think, in the end, come up with the definitive account. We are now, this day, going through the impeachment of the former president on exactly that issue. So how do you explain to the public the delay in getting the vital truth?
So Michael, I want you to answer that question. I'm going to set it up with some other questions if you can. So I wrote a chapter in a book I recently wrote called After Trump, and it was about reforming the presidency. One chapter was called The Bureaucracy Against the President. Almost all of our other reform discussions were about what Trump had done wrong, but your focus is on the Justice Department. And basically our chapter was a summary of your reports, starting with the Hillary Clinton email investigation report, going through the Carter Page FISA report, and then some other ones related to those. And now you have on your docket the investigation that Bob just mentioned. I don't know if perhaps you can at least describe that for the audience, what that involves in terms of its jurisdictional scope. I'm just wondering if so you focused, on the foibles, I keep using that word. You focus on the problems in the department. I mean, we can talk about the president, but there were problems of accountability and governance, serious ones, common themes across these very different types of report, looking at different administrations and different problems. So can you talk about all of those things, the lessons learned from these reports, your current report investigation from January 6th and or January, I guess, the January events in the department and what that involves, and what the department needs to do to fix these problems?
Absolutely. So we've got the review we announced about the events on January 6th at the Capitol. We're doing a joint review with the DHS IG and the Defense Department IG and the Interior IG. Interior is the Park Police is part of them. So the three of us, the four of us, are going to work together to do a review to look at intelligence information available in advance of January 6th. What was known, what was done, what wasn't done, what was shared, what wasn't shared. It may well be that it was well shared. It may well be it wasn't well shared, but we think we owe it to the public as the four IGs of these key executive branch law enforcement agencies to report out to the public, as you said, on what occurred and what, as Bob said, what occurred on that day, both in advance of it and as the day unfolded. Because as press reports have indicated, there's a lot of question both in advance and on the day of about the National Guard, its role, whether they were allowed on, whether they were allowed in, calls that were occurring. So those are the kinds of issues that we're going to be looking at. In addition, we've announced that we're going to be looking at the allegations that there were personnel in the Justice Department who may have been involved in an effort to use the Justice Department's authorities to improperly seek to impact the 2020 presidential election. That's a separate additional review that we've announced that is ongoing, and it also will take a considerable amount of time. So those are the two we have now ongoing. As to the others and sort of the learnings from them, I think there are several. I think facts do matter. I think truth does matter. That has to be the foundation on which we're all operating. If that goes away, then what we do, what journalists do, gets seriously called into question, and the value of what we do gets seriously called into question. But I do think, both based on my experience, our experience in our reports, and the work I've seen, the great work from journalists, I think it does matter. I think it does have an impact. I think there are problems and challenges that are far greater today than there were in past years. But I think it does matter. And I go back to what I see as, and could talk about further, has been the response and reaction to our work. I think the other thing I'll just mention here is in terms of takeaways, and you and I have talked about this a lot, norms matter. Not the law. I hate to break this in a Harvard Law event from someone who's a graduate, but the law only does so much. There has to be an understanding beyond just what's written on a paper, what's written in a statute, what's written in a policy. There has to be an understanding of what the norm is and a respect for what your role is in government. And that's one of the things we talk about, and I talk about as an IG. I'm independent, but I'm not unmoored from the Justice Department. I'm not a free agent in the constitutional system. I've got to know what the IG Act provides and what my role is and what it isn't. And I think what you've seen in some of our reports is an effort by some players in that to do more than what their role was, and to not play by the norms. And playing by the norms, I think, would have made perhaps a difference.
So I want to follow up on that before going back to Bob, but I agree. But I think it's kind of criticism in your reports that cut across. I agree about the importance of norms. The criticism in your reports that cut across a lot of the investigations was these norms are just kind of free floating, and they need to be written down. They need to be specified. They need to be trained upon. And so it seems to me that almost every important norm you talked about had an uncertain basis, either completely or at the margins. And so one of your big recommendations was norms are important, but we need to specify them even if they're not quote unquote legally binding. Can you comment on that?
I agree completely. I mean, it's been an unfortunate part of this job to see that certain things that you would have thought were a given had to be written down and had to be put in writing. I'll give you a simple one that didn't make as many headlines, but we did a report several years ago about DEA agents engaged in prostitution overseas in Colombia. And one of the responses we heard from the agents was, well, it was legal there, even if it wasn't legal for us here. Now, as anybody in law enforcement knows, it creates all sorts of security risks beyond the propriety of the underlying activity. It's just something can't happen. And Attorney General Holder had to put out a memo that said, you cannot engage in prostitution overseas. I know from internally that was somewhat embarrassing for the Attorney General of the United States to have to tell Justice Department employees and law enforcement that that was the case. But that, to your point of the norms, that's similar in some of the norms. Things, in some respects, just have to be written down.
So, Bob, I want to come back to follow up on the question I asked before, and that is, the question is, in terms of in thinking about presidential reform and accountability reform, the question is ultimately, is Trump a one-off? So after Nixon, as I alluded to earlier, we had a whole series of reforms, Presidential Accountability Act, Ethics in Government, a whole bunch of norm-based reforms.
IG Act.
the Inspector General Act of 1978, a whole bunch of norm-based reforms about White House contacts, the relationship between the White House and the Justice Department. And my view is that those reforms were, for the most part, there's some exceptions, remarkably consequential and effective. They didn't always, that they worked better, I think, than most people realize. They didn't always work during the Trump administration because he was such an unusual figure. But the question is, should we view Trump as a one-off, that because now, Biden's president, things seem to have gone back to normal in terms of, and it's early, but that by normal, I mean, even the variety of presidents in between Nixon and Trump were quite different, but basically the norms and rules of these reforms worked pretty well. So I'm just wondering whether you think Trump as well as any journalist, whether you think, and you've known these other presidents, is Trump a unique figure that we don't need to worry about changing the presidential rules for, or does the presidency need significant reform?
Well, the system, I want to go back to just the mind-boggling fact that we're going through the impeachment of a former president on the issue that Michael Horowitz is going to spend months or a year studying. And when that report comes out, I think people are going to ask the question, well, why didn't we know some of this sooner? And, I don't know how you fix that. Now, the question of, is Trump unique? I spent a great deal of time talking with him about what happened in 2016, why he won, and what he perceived, I think intuitively, not intellectually, is that the old order in both parties, the Democratic and the Republican Party, was not meeting the needs of people. And he seized history's clock. And sitting in the Oval Office, I pointed to that grandfather clock and said, "You seized history's clock." And he jumped in his chair. Yes, exactly. And maintained he would do it again. Of course, as we now know, he did not. He lost the election. But I am not a great admirer of the discussion of norms, simply because Trump was elected to bust the norms. He would not have received 74 million votes last year in the election if he'd been a normal president. And so is that different? I don't know. I am confident that when the history books are written about the Trump presidency, they're going to look specifically at the handling of COVID-19, because we're approaching 500,000 people have been killed, and President Trump was warned. He had the bully pulpit 6-7 days after he received that warning, in detail. I mean, it's the sort of thing I spent, as I said, 4 or 5 months chasing exactly what happened and what he knew. He gave a State of the Union address 6 days later, and he could have said to the public, "I got this warning that this awful virus from China is coming, and I want to tell you what I learned and what remedies are possible, like wearing a mask and social distancing and washing your hands." It would have been a very unusual State of the Union address for a president to get up there and say you need to wash your hands to save our country. But we now know, and the experts would agree, that that would have changed history in a dramatic way. And he failed to do that because, and you're going to have to go to psychiatry to understand this, but organizationally, when Michael is working on a case, or when you're teaching a class or writing one of your books, Jack, you organize things, you read things, you plan, you think strategically. Trump never thought strategically. He was impulse driven in a way that drove his key cabinet members and advisors crazy. And my conclusion at the end of the book, in many ways, maybe is mild. I just said he was the wrong man for the job. Didn't get into the politics of this, but it is a failure, a dereliction of basic duty. And, I think you could argue he should be impeached for the handling of the virus, not for what, or maybe also for what happened January 6th. But the virus is the calamity. This is a unique collapse of presidential authority and if I may say this, because so many people have died, it is a moral failing. And, in the law, it's very difficult to talk about moral failings, but I think that's what happened here.
So I'm going to comment on that and then ask Michael to follow up. I just want to let the audience know that if we're going to start taking questions, I can try to convey your questions. So if you have them, please start sending them to me in the question and answer function on Zoom. I agree that the Trump's performance during COVID was an utter failure of leadership. And in fact, I think it shows that he really was never interested in governing. I mean, or at least he wasn't good at traditional governing. That was the opportunity. There was all these worries about Trump being an authoritarian, and there were obviously reasons to worry about that. But in so many instances when he could have legitimately exercised presidential power, he just wasn't up to it. And that was one. I mean, he had many legal tools and leadership tools available to him, and he just didn't. He just wasn't capable of exercising them. So, Michael, I want to ask you a series of questions about I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions. You can answer which ones you want, and then I want to take some questions from the audience. I want to know if you have any comments on Bob's comment that, that Trump was elected to violate norms, and how that might impinge at all on what you do, which is not to assess presidential norm following, but to assess Justice Department norm following. And then I want, if you could just tell us, about the state of the Inspector General Corps today. Trump was hard on inspectors general. He fired a lot, I think more than any other president. He tried to manipulate the vacancy system to put for his friends, or at least his people he had more confidence in as head of IGs. Just comment on in general how the IG system is working today after 4 years of Trump. But I also wonder if you have a comment on this idea, and it's a very good one. We tried to deal with it in our book about what happens when a president is elected precisely to break norms.
Yeah, and I agree with Bob, and I agree with you that that was what happened here, was norm breaking, and that was part of it, that norms didn't matter. And it's obviously hard to impossible to anticipate that and plan for that, other than, again, as you noted earlier, putting down on paper as much as you can in terms of what is policy, what is required, and how things should be done and followed. And we're always very good at reacting to what has occurred, and always not so good at anticipating what could occur. Again, for the reasons I think in part that I mentioned, we don't sometimes think about what could happen. I mean, if we're obviously just starting this review, but for those who read the news accounts of the reporting about what allegedly occurred at the Justice Department in connection with, in January and before that, with the claims that there was an effort to see if the acting attorney general could get removed and things like that, it's almost as if, I'm not sure Bob could have written such a good story as a fiction story with all of his experience had he tried to do so. And so I think that's the challenge, but I agree on the norms front. In terms of, what has it meant for the IG community? It was certainly a challenging time for that reason. And look, particularly challenging in the last year when 2 IGs were fired. Both, I think it can fairly be said, for doing their jobs. not because they engaged in misconduct, but for doing their jobs. And there have been IGs removed before, and there have been debates as to whether it was a pretense or not, doing their job or not in some instances, but never as clearly, I think, as it's was the case here in terms of their, removals. And on top of that, in the case of the IG at the State Department, he was replaced by a political appointee from the agency itself to go in and be the independent IG overseeing that very agency. All of which, by the way, legal. That is, as you know, under the Vacancies Act, and you cover this in your book, authorized by the Vacancies Act. The same time, the president did the same thing at the Transportation Department. There was already a vacancy there because the IG had retired, so he wasn't removed, but he removed the acting deputy IG who was serving that job, and again, put in a political appointee from the agency to run the organization. Obviously, those kinds of issues are significant challenges for us in the community. And one of the things we're looking to do is get legislative reform, and you touch on this in your book, on the Vacancies Act to tighten it up, because while the president may be difficult to limit the president's removal authority constitutionally, there's no reason the president should have the right to then put in a political appointee or crony to serve in that job as a result of that. That isn't constitutionally required.
Yeah.
So we want to try and address that. We also want to tighten up the removal provisions where we can constitutionally. And also, I think engage with folks and thinking about, and you've written a whole book about this, but as the presidency and the executive branch authorities have grown and strengthened, it demonstrates the need for greater oversight and accountability. They should go hand in hand at a certain level. And that, I think, is the challenge going forward for all of us.
Just a quick follow-up, just to clarify, you just answered one of the questions that the questioners had, which is what can be done to protect IGs from being fired by a president who's not committed to independent oversight. And you said two things, as I understand it. One, even though it's challenging constitutionally, try to tighten up, to try to raise the standards for firing with some kind of for-cause provision, whatever that might look like. And two, and this is the one that I favor because I think it's more constitutional and probably more effective, to limit the president's options for replacing a fired inspector general. Did I get you right on those two?
Yeah, let me just clarify on the first one. There is discussion about the for-cause removal provision. I think, as you and I've talked about this, there are serious questions about its constitutionality, particularly given recent Supreme Court decision and a pending Supreme Court case on these issues and where the law seems to be going. But there can be ways to tighten up the removal provisions. For example, there is already a 30-day notice provision in the law. President has to give 30-day notice before removing an IG. But what the president did in this case, in both instances, was give the notice. And as Senator Grassley wrote to the president, didn't give the kind of notice that was expected under the law. So you could tighten that provision. And the president immediately removed the IG from the position and put that person on essentially administrative paid leave. So they couldn't go to their office, they couldn't do their job. That seems wholly inconsistent with the idea of 30-day notice. And at the very same moment, dropped in the political appointee. There's no vacancy at that point, in my view. And so it raises the question of how you can have an acting IG appointed when the law requires 30 days notice before you remove the existing IG. Right. So there's that piece of it. That's the first part of it.
Right.
And the second is, as you indicated, the Vacancies Act, I think, is, you've quite effectively laid out in various pieces, is up to Congress to decide and would not implicate constitutional issues. And I think it's very important to take away this incentive and upending of the IG system by allowing, by law, a political appointee to come in and be serving as an acting. And as we've seen under the Vacancies Act, that's allowed for 210 days. And by the way, if you nominate somebody, it goes on while the nomination's pending. So you can nominate an unqualified candidate knowing that they won't be confirmed by the Senate. And that just allows you to keep that person you really want in the job.
Right. So Bob, I want to come back to your skepticism about norms. We have a question about how democratic norms are fragile, they're easy to break and hard to build. And I take your point that the American people in 2016 knowingly elected a knowing norm breaker. But does that mean we should just throw up our hands about norms? I mean, some norms, the president's treatment of the press, you might think the president can act with a few little, with some limitations at the extremes the way he wants. But there's a real problem in some areas because the president is charged with controlling law enforcement, for example. It's mostly norms that govern the relationship between a president and who the attorney general is going to prosecute. Is the attorney general going to prosecute the president's friends? Is the enemies? Is the attorney general going to lay off the president's friends? Trump really pushed those rule of law norms. Shattered those rule of law norms. And so I'm just wondering if your skepticism about norms even extends there, and if not, whether you think that's worth bucking up.
Well, the problem is who decides norms, and we know they change from president to president. And I don't know, do you write them down? Again, I think we need to go to 500,000 feet for a moment in what we're talking about. And that is, do collectively the press, the daily press, book writers, IGs, congressional oversight and committees and so forth, and do the collective process that we have in this country tell the people enough about what's going on fast enough? And I think we need to accept some responsibility. I'm not exactly sure how you speed it up and correct it, but that the full story of Trump and what he was doing, and not the violation of norms, the violation of the law, the violation of something that I think figures in a very overwhelming way, and that is common sense and logic. We all learn in our lives that common sense can drive lots of things, and a president with strong common sense can do a lot more than one that kind of says, oh, I'm going to follow all of the traditional norms. So I think we've got a lot of work and rethinking to do in government and in the media, and that we shouldn't get in a look. Trump last year, if 44,000 votes changed in Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia, he would be president again. 44,000 votes. People say, oh, well, he won by 7 million. Biden won by 7 million. That's true. But when you get into the nitty gritty, it's not by much in those 3 states. So did we serve to tell people? I think the press was very aggressive. I think the press did some remarkable work, and certainly Michael with the whole FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, exposed the Steele dossier, which was this dossier that turns out was funded in part by the Democrats that had all these allegations against Trump. And we could go through the way that was mishandled was a glorious mistake for the FBI, and I would say for the media who absorbed a lot of that. I mean, Michael, you found out that the Steele dossier was relied on by the FBI and the FISA court, and it shouldn't have been. It was suspect. That's an amazing discovery.
Bob, let me follow up on the role of the press in holding presidents accountable. I believe I've heard you say a couple of times, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, in the past that you thought that sometimes, and I think you were being gentle, the president, the press as a whole was overreacting to Trump, that every little thing he did, it was becoming they were just an overreaction to what he was doing, and they weren't focusing on what was important. And I'm wondering, first of all, that I characterize you, I mean, I just want you to assess how the press did under Trump in terms of covering him.
A lot of the substantive reporting was excellent. The problem was that he so violated the truth and said things and did things that were just not true. I think a lot of people in the press, I think a lot of people in politics became emotionally derailed by him, and that they, put simply, lost their cool. And I think in politics and journalism, in the presidency, you want to maintain your cool if that's at all possible. So, people are going to go back and be looking at this, but again, you have to look at the other side. There are things he did not start a war. A lot of people thought he was going to start a war. He did not send FBI agents into my office to break in and discover who sources were, where I was getting information. There was a kind of, and I can't fully explain this, restraint in some of his actions, not his words and not the way he behaved, but if you really think this through, there was a restraint at times. Now, a lot of people would disagree with that. A lot of people feel the January 6th insurrection is the crime of the century. And, they may be right, that may be sorted out, but I think we've got to look introspectively how we do our job, and is the person, the man or woman on the street, served with enough information about this astonishing constitutional concentration of power in the executive branch and presidency.
I agree with you for what it's worth. I mean, Trump was such a paradoxical president, and his presidency was so paradoxical in many ways. So there was the authoritarian rhetoric, there was the constant claims of extreme executive power. There was an occasional nod in that direction, and sometimes he broke law, and often he broke norms. But on the other hand, there was extraordinary, you called it restraint. Maybe that's what it was. That entails a kind of self-consciousness on the part of the president that I'm not sure was there. But there's a lot of things that he wasn't aggressive his prior presidents. The war powers is a great example. Some administrative law matters, he wasn't as aggressive as President Obama was. So it's just a paradoxical presidency altogether. Michael, I want to ask you, one of the questions in the queue is something that you talked a lot about or around, and that you've been up close with the last 4 years and probably before that. And the question is, how should those within the bureaucracy react when the president or those above them are breaking these important norms or laws?
It's a great question and an important one. And it's one of the things we try and get the word out as IGs, that we are always there to receive information. The IG Act provides protection from disclosure of identities. And we strongly encourage people to come forward with that information, and so that we can follow up on it. I think one of the interesting moments as an IG for me actually came about after the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York resigned and left his job, Jeff Berman, back last year, when there was concerns raised about whether he was being pushed out for political reasons. And Attorney General Barr issued a statement that said, okay, if that's your concern, I'm hereby authorizing the IG to hear any of your complaints and follow up on them. So go tell him if you think this is anything nefarious is going on. And then obviously I wouldn't say whether we got knocks on our door or not, but I think that goes to some of the discussions we've had about why accountability matters and IGs are important. And it was a particularly important moment because, as you know, the discussions around whether IGs are even constitutional or should be in existence has been very much a talking point for 30 years, particularly for those who believe in a unified executive theory. So I think that is an example of our value and the importance and what we want to be, those bureaucrats, which should not be a pejorative term, should do if they feel like that's happening.
So I'll state the point that you just made more sharply because you can't. Bill Barr, I agree with you. That was an extraordinary and underappreciated moment when Bill Barr, who has been a critic of the Inspector General Act and of Inspector Generals, especially early in his career, since the 70s.
I was going to say, but not when he was AG.
I know, but that's my point, is that by the time he's AG, and even in his confirmation hearings, he had accepted it and accepted its legitimacy, and he relied on it, and he relied on you there to establish the credibility of one of his actions that would have otherwise been suspicious. So we've got only a couple of minutes because the students have to go to class at 1. I just want to know if y'all have any wrap-up comments about the state of the presidency and presidential accountability and what needs to be done. And Bob, I just want to put this to you. You don't have to answer it if you have something else to say, but you talked about how the press needs to reflect upon itself and reform itself. The press has changed enormously over the course of your career in so many ways. It's splintered, it's more on television, Twitter is important. We now know members of the press wear their politics on their sleeve on Twitter. There's bubbling of people getting their news in the way they want. So I'm just wondering what the likelihood of that reflection and reform on some of the problems of the last 4 years, is that likely to happen?
Well, we'll see, but I think it's a big burden, and I think an ingredient in this, if I may go back and tell quickly a story. Catherine Graham, who was the owner, the publisher of the Washington Post, and backed the Watergate reporting that Carl and I did in the face of a lot of resistance from the government and even internally at the Washington Post. After Nixon resigned, she wrote Carl Bernstein and myself a letter, and not on stationery, but on a yellow legal pad, like you lawyers would do. And she just picked it up, and I think it was a spontaneous but important moment. And she wrote, "Dear Carl and Bob, you did some of the stories about Nixon. Now he's gone. Now don't start thinking too highly of yourselves. And I want to give you some advice. And the advice is beware the demon pomposity." And pomposity in the press, in academia, in the legal profession, in Wall Street, in politics, is one of the diseases that is all around us. And everyone, you can feel confident in your work, but I think for people who are doing things publicly, like the press or authors or professors even, and certainly people in the government, that you have a responsibility to tune down the smugness and arrogance and self-satisfaction that even can come with a good job well done, because it interferes with the communication to the public, and the distrust of government, the distrust of the media, in part stems from that demon pomposity. And I can't say I live by it, but I know it's out there, and I think it's an important lesson from one of the great publishers and media figures of all time.
That's a wonderful thought. Michael, we only have a minute or two.
Yep.
I just wonder if you have any final reflections, and I'll give you one tip off, but you don't have to answer it. And that is, here we are 4 years after the most extraordinary, unprecedented assault on our governing and normative institutions in the executive branch. Okay, I don't qualifying. There's a debate about what, Trump versus Nixon, because they were doing things on different dimensions. But it's really an extraordinary testing of institutions. How do you did we do better than people think? Did we do better than how did things shake out? I mean, 4 years looking back on it, you've carried on your job. You've put out these reports that have been consequential without interference, with political consequences left, right, and center. How do you think the institutions in the executive branch have worked?
Well, I think, as you noted, many of them, they survived, right? And they're still standing. We're still here as IGs. We're still doing our work. I think there was a fair amount of tension on them, and they were pushed and pulled to great degrees. But I do think we're still standing, and I think that's a positive. I think there is a value and a recognition of them. Perhaps we didn't get the full-throated support all the time that we wished we had gotten, but we did. And I'll say this about where we ended up, because I always like to quote Justice Brandeis and his famous saying about transparency being the best of disinfectants. And I think that's still true to this day, that when, maybe not for everybody, but for all of us who've been in government or covered government, when those stories are written and people see their wrongdoing, misconduct, violations in print or on television, it makes them think about what just occurred, and it makes those behind them think long and hard about it. I know from our work that our reports from back in the day on how the FBI did its work, or DEA did its work, or others, people remember that. They have long memories at the Justice Department. And so I think transparency matters. I think it does bring accountability, and I think we have to do more of it, as Bob said.
It's a great place to end. Thank you both very much for a wonderful conversation. Thanks to the Law and Government Program of Study at Harvard. Thanks to our audience for your good questions and for attending. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.